When I was 12, my family moved to a small town in upstate New York, surrounded by thick forests and winding dirt roads. Our new house had a detached cabin a few hundred yards into the woods, which my parents referred to as the guest cabin. It was rustic but had electricity and heating, making it perfect for weekend hangouts. A month after we moved in, I invited 3 friends, Evan, Mason, and Luke, for a sleepover in the guest cabin. It was the kind of place that screamed adventure, and we were eager to turn it into our private hideout for the weekend. My parents stocked the cabin with snacks, sleeping bags, and flashlights, and warned us to stay close to the house if we wandered outside. We spent the first few hours playing video games and exploring the cabin. There was something oddly fascinating about its aged walls and creaky floors. Evan, the self-proclaimed explorer of our group, suggested we check out the woods behind the cabin once it got dark. The idea thrilled us, and despite my initial hesitation, I agreed. At around 9 p.m., armed with flashlights and a sense of bravery only preteens could muster, we ventured into the woods. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed alive with the chirps of crickets and the rustling of leaves. We walked for about 10 minutes when Luke pointed out a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. Curious, we followed it until we reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a strange, dilapidated structure. What looked like an old well, its stone walls covered in moss and vines. A rusty metal grate covered the opening. "What do you think's down there?" Evan asked, his voice tinged with excitement. None of us wanted to find out, but Evan insisted on peering through the grate. As he bent over, a loud thud echoed from somewhere nearby, like a heavy object falling onto the forest floor. We froze. "What was that?" Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. We swung our flashlights in every direction, but the dense trees and underbrush revealed nothing. "Probably an animal," Luke said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Then we heard it again. This time, it was closer. "Let's go back," I said, my heart pounding. The others nodded, and we hurried back to the cabin, our imaginations running wild with what could have made those noises. Once inside, we locked the door and tried to shake off the unease. Evan, who always had a way of turning fear into humor, joked about the well being a portal to another dimension. His words didn't ease my nerves. Something about the clearing felt wrong. At midnight, we decided to call it a night. Evan and I shared one of the bunks while Mason and Luke took the other. I was on the verge of falling asleep when I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. 3 deliberate taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Evan. He groaned, half asleep. "Probably just a branch," he muttered. I wanted to believe him, but the taps continued, growing louder. "Mason, Luke," I hissed. "Wake up." They stirred, annoyed, until the tapping turned into a loud bang. All 4 of us bolted upright, our flashlights aimed at the window. Outside, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was a figure. It stood motionless, its head slightly tilted, as though it were observing us. Mason screamed, and the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. "What the hell was that?" Luke yelled, his voice trembling. None of us had an answer. We barricaded the door with a heavy wooden bench and sat huddled together, too terrified to move. For hours, nothing happened. We convinced ourselves it was a prank, maybe some older kids from the neighborhood messing with us. But just as we began to relax, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed around the cabin, circling it slowly. Then came the voice. Low and guttural, it called out, "Come outside. I just want to talk." We didn't move. None of us even dared to breathe. The voice came again, louder this time. "I know you're in there. Come out." Evan whispered that we needed to get back to the main house. We agreed, but the thought of stepping outside was paralyzing. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. Mason cracked the door open and peeked outside. "I think it's gone," he whispered. We grabbed our flashlights and bolted, sprinting through the woods toward the house. The moment we reached the back porch, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We made it. My parents woke up to our frantic banging on the door. We told them everything, But when my dad went out to check the cabin, he found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My friends and I avoided the woods, and my parents dismissed the whole thing as a bad dream. But late one night, I woke up to that same tapping on my bedroom window. This time, I didn't look. When I was 13, my friend Alex invited me and two others, Nathan and Ellie, to a sleepover at his new house. Alex's family had just moved to a sprawling old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The place had this timeless charm: peeling white paint, creaky floorboards, and a wraparound porch, but it also felt empty. It sat isolated, with only a vast field of overgrown grass stretching behind it, leading to a dense patch of woods. The first half of the evening was uneventful. We played video games in Alex's room, ate snacks, and made plans to explore the woods the next day. As night fell, the house took on a different character. The creaks in the floors seemed louder, and the howling wind made the walls shudder slightly. Alex joked that the house was haunted, which earned him an eye roll from Ellie and a nervous laugh from Nathan. Around 11 p.m., Alex suggested we tell scary stories. I wasn't in the mood. I'd always been more sensitive to that kind of stuff, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill. We turned off the lights and lit a single candle Alex had swiped from the kitchen. As the shadows danced on the walls, Alex launched into his story about a ghost that supposedly haunted his backyard woods. According to him, a group of kids had gone missing there years ago, and locals swore they could still hear voices calling for help late at night. It was a good story, too good. By the time he finished, I was already regretting letting him start. "It's just a legend," Ellie said, though her voice wavered slightly. Nathan didn't say anything, just stared at the flickering candle. "Let's test it," Alex said suddenly. "What do you mean, test it?" Nathan asked, his voice uneasy. "Let's go outside," Alex grinned. "See if we hear anything." "No way," Ellie said, hugging her knees. "That's stupid." But Alex was already standing, grabbing a flashlight. Nathan and I exchanged a nervous glance, but I didn't want to be the coward who stayed behind. Ellie protested all the way down the stairs, but eventually, she followed us onto the porch. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the field. The tall grass swayed gently in the wind, but beyond that, the woods were an impenetrable wall of black. We stuck close together as we crossed the field, the flashlight bouncing with each step. By the time we reached the woods, I could feel my pulse in my throat. Alex was fearless, or at least pretending to be, and led the way. "Okay," Ellie said sharply. "We're here. Let's listen." We all stood still, straining our ears. For a while, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves. I started to relax, thinking Alex's story was just that, a story. Then I heard it, a faint hum. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, clearer. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like a melody. I looked at Alex, and the smug confidence on his face had vanished. "Do you hear that?" Ellie whispered. "Yes," Nathan said, his voice trembling. "It's like singing." We should have left. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run back to the house, but curiosity, or maybe fear of looking weak, rooted me in place. The singing grew louder, and it was unmistakable now. Multiple voices, soft and melodic, weaving together in an otherworldly harmony. It was beautiful, but also deeply wrong. The voices didn't sound human. They were too perfect, too synchronized, like a recording played on a loop. Alex stepped forward, his flashlight aimed into the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost suffocating. "We should go back," Ellie whispered, clutching my arm. For once, I agreed with her, but Alex didn't move. He swung the flashlight around, trying to pierce the darkness. Then we saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of the light. They weren't moving, just standing there, perfectly still. I couldn't make out their faces, but their silhouettes were unnaturally tall and thin. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Who are you?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figures didn't respond. Instead, the singing started again, louder this time, almost deafening. The sound seemed to vibrate through the air, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. "Run!" Nathan screamed, snapping us out of our trance. We bolted. I don't remember much about the run back to the house, just the sheer, animalistic panic that drove me forward. The singing followed us, growing fainter as we neared the porch. By the time we slammed the door shut behind us, the sound had stopped completely. We didn't sleep that night. We huddled in Alex's room, too scared to even peek out the window. In the morning, the field and woods looked normal, peaceful even. But none of us wanted to go near them. Alex moved out of that house a year later. He never talked about that night again, and neither did we. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about those figures in the woods and the haunting melody that seemed to seep into my bones. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to hear their song. Back when I was 15, I had a sleepover at my cousin Kira's house. She lived in a modest, two-story home in a quiet suburb. We'd been close since we were little, but as we got older, sleepovers became less about playing with toys and more about gossiping, binging TV shows, and eating junk food. That night, Kira and I were joined by our mutual friend, Alyssa. The plan was simple: watch movies, eat pizza, and talk about our latest high school drama until we fell asleep. It was the kind of ordinary, unremarkable night that, looking back, should have stayed ordinary. Kira's bedroom was on the second floor, and it was small but cozy. The window overlooked the backyard, which was bordered by a tall wooden fence. She had a queen-sized bed, so the three of us decided to squeeze onto it rather than bother with an air mattress. The evening started off perfectly. We laughed until our stomachs hurt, watching terrible rom-coms and sharing inside jokes. By midnight, we were all starting to drift off. Kira was already half asleep, curled up on the edge of the bed, while Alyssa and I whispered quietly about our latest crushes. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. That's when we heard the first noise. It sounded like crying, a muffled, strangled sob coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal outside. But then it came again, louder this time. Alyssa froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. "Is it your parents?" I asked Kira, shaking her awake. Kira sat up groggily. "What?" she muttered. "There's someone crying," Alyssa said. "Listen." We all held our breath, straining to hear. The crying was faint but unmistakable, a soft, pitiful wail that seemed to echo through the walls. Kira frowned. "Maybe it's the TV downstairs," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Let's check," Alyssa suggested, grabbing her phone as a makeshift flashlight. Reluctantly, we crept out of the room and into the hallway. The sound grew louder as we approached the staircase, but it still felt distant, as though it was coming from multiple directions at once. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we realized the TV wasn't on, and the crying wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from the basement. "Nope," I said immediately, backing away. Basements were never a good idea in these situations. But Alyssa, always the curious one, was already moving toward the door. "Kira," she whispered, "does your basement have a window? Maybe someone's outside." Kira shook her head. "The only window is tiny, and it's covered by a metal grate. No one could fit through it." Alyssa hesitated, but then the crying changed. It wasn't sobbing anymore. It sounded more like gasping, like someone was struggling to breathe. "We have to see what's down there," she said. "No, we don't," I protested. "If someone's hurt, we call the police, not go looking ourselves." But before I could stop her, Alyssa opened the basement door. The sound hit us like a wave, louder, more desperate, as if whoever was crying was just at the bottom of the stairs. Alyssa clicked on the light, but the bulb only cast a weak, flickering glow over the top few steps. The rest of the basement remained shrouded in darkness. "Hello?" Alyssa called. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, came a voice, a raspy, broken whisper. "Help me." I grabbed Alyssa's arm and yanked her back. "We're calling the police," I said firmly, slamming the door shut. Kira was already on her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator stayed on the line with us, instructing us to lock ourselves in a room and wait for the police. We huddled in Kira's bedroom, every creak and groan of the house making us jump. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house, including the basement. They found no one. The officer assured us it was probably just an animal or the wind playing tricks on us, but his explanation didn't sit right. Wind doesn't cry, and animals don't whisper for help. After the police left, we tried to settle down, but sleep was impossible. Around 3 a.m., just as we were starting to calm down, we heard it again. The crying. This time, it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the backyard. Alyssa and I bolted to the window, our breath fogging up the glass as we peered into the darkness. At first, we saw nothing but the faint outline of the fence and the shadowy shapes of the trees. Then, just as we were about to step back, something moved. A figure was standing at the edge of the yard, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was too far away to make out any details, but the way it stood, motionless, facing the house, was enough to send a chill down my spine. The crying had stopped, but I could feel its eyes on us. We backed away from the window, too scared to scream. Kira grabbed her phone to call the police again, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. None of us ever slept in that house again. Kira's family moved out a month later, though they never told us why. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice in the basement and the figure in the yard. Were they the same? Or were we dealing with something worse? Whatever it was, I don't think it wanted help. It wanted us.